In this video, we are shooting on the Canon R6II, the Nikon Z5II, and the Sony a7IV. And this video is about understanding where these full-frame professional entry-level cameras are. What can we expect from them, and how do they compare? In this video, we're going to be using the ubiquitous 50mm 1.8 that all of these manufacturers sell. They're all of similar qualities, but there are some differences between them. We will get into that. Along with that, I have chosen the 24-105 for all three of these camera mounts, although the Nikon one is a 24-120. They are all f4s through the range. Now, what's really amazing about all of these systems is how they do things differently. This video will not cover everything. Hopefully, we're going to just cover some of the things that you're most interested in seeing. This will not be an exhaustive video because we cannot have every lens, and I cannot go through everything that these cameras do. They actually do so many of these things differently. Yes. Even base ISO doesn't seem to be exactly the same across all of these cameras. The Z5II and the R6II, they are both 24 megapixels, whereas the a7IV is 33 megapixels. How does this impact us? Is it important? The Sony is the most expensive and the Z5II is the most affordable, almost $1,000 cheaper than the a7IV. So when you pull all of this together, and the fact that these cameras came out roughly 3.5, roughly 2.5 years ago, and very recently for the Z5II, this makes for a very interesting video that just has so many data points. All right, let's get into it.
Please remember the chapter markers are here for you to jump to any part in this video at any time. See you there. The contemporary professional entry to 35mm censored cameras. Sony a7IV, Canon R6II, Nikon Z5II.
I want to talk a little bit about the complexity of this video and actually trying to work out real world how these cameras compare. Each camera probably has something like at least 200 to 300 data points within it, from how it functions to the ergonomics to the menus to the lens selection, IBIS, video codecs, on it goes. And then if you multiply that by 3, then you're talking about at least 1,000 data points. But then in some of these things, we're talking about a scale within that data point. The permutations are, well, in the thousands. There is, unless we do university or scientific, professional scientific level testing, no way that we can get across all of that. 1, in the real world, and 2, in a video like this. So what we try and do is set up some real world scenarios, daylight, nighttime, a few different types of scenes, moving and not moving, and we try to create a baseline. My plan here is this is not the only video that's going to feature these 3 cameras, it's the first. And over time, I want to deep dive into some of the more important areas. For example, video codecs or autofocus, because just those topics alone would have hundreds, if not thousands, of data points because, as I said, it's not just binary. A lot of these things have multiples. For example, the number of codecs that each of these cameras have available to them might be anywhere between 15 or something on the lowest and maybe 30 on the highest. So there's just so much that you can look at. Then you can look at those codecs with different lenses. Then you can look at those codecs in night and day, and suddenly you've got, I don't know, 200, 400, whatever it is, permutations just looking at video codec performance. I think the most important thing out of any camera system is its image quality, because whether you shoot fast or slow, we all need image quality. Doesn't matter what you're doing, doesn't matter what your use case is, image quality. Autofocus is very important, and that's another major topic of discussion. But there are other areas like in-body image stabilization, connectivity, ports, ergonomics, build quality, and so on. Because image quality is, from my perspective, the baseline of any camera. If a camera has bad image quality, you don't want to buy it. If a camera has fantastic image quality, then you do want to buy it. And obviously a big part of image quality is lenses, which is something we'll talk about as well. Because image quality is the most important in this video, it takes up about half of the video because we are looking at 3 cameras, 3 times everything, 2 different lenses, 6 times everything, night and day, 12 times everything. And thus, even if you spend a minute or 2 on each of those variables, you're suddenly at 20 or 25 minutes. But what's important here is I wanted to show with real world data captured at the same time on the same rig with these cameras just a few inches or centimeters apart, the same settings, with the same lens where possible from the original equipment manufacturer. In other words, trying to standardize everything as much as I humanly could. Now, not all of this is perfect, and as I said, I want to do more videos where we dive into each topic one at a time because they are actually so complicated, and it really is quite hard to get these things as standardized as possible. And not only does that include the rig, but it also includes the file types. In other words, we shoot RAW and then we strip as much out of those RAW files as we can in order to have a baseline when we're editing. So that's another part of it. And also the same with video. When it comes to video, neither the Canon R6II or the Sony a7IV shoot RAW internally. Only the Z5II does. And thus we had to rely on log to get a baseline, which I think is fine for this test. I've been trying to collect as much data as I possibly could. A lot of the metrics, for example, what are the materials used to make these bodies? What are the composites or plastics? Some of that information just doesn't seem to be readily available. And thus some information is pretty hard to come by. And I'm open, of course, to anybody letting me know if they know some parts of these cameras that's just not widely available on the internet to find that information. I was using Google, I was using Google AI, and I was using ChatGPT in order to cross-reference and get as much data as I could, let alone going to the manufacturer's own websites. But in the case of all of them, they don't publish everything about everything with these cameras. And in some cases, I found that if I went to the specifications in one country, it had more data than another country. And even data can vary between, say, retailers, other reviewers, and the original equipment manufacturer. So in regards to checking this data, most of it is triple or quadruple checked, but even then, you just never know. But I've done my best to get all these numbers as accurate as possible. If you want to watch this long video, I think it'll be fulfilling and you will learn a lot from it. In the near future, I plan to do a cut down version of this video where there's just less examples. So you might want to wait for that one. I am going to show you the scores here at the start so you can see how the camera's fared, and then you can decide to watch the video or not to see the method and how I got to those scores. If you want to comment, fair enough, comment. But I do think if you are going to comment on a particular feature, you do need to watch that section in order to actually know what I said. Interestingly, a lot of people will comment when they haven't watched something to the end. And often, because time is linear, well, we can't say everything in the same moment. So sometimes you've got to listen to commentary from the beginning to the end to actually understand everything that somebody said. I think this is really important. There is literally nothing that can beat using these cameras together. And if anyone hasn't really done that, well, then they haven't been through this experience. Even hand holding the cameras can change the outcome. Even having a slightly different lens, slightly different settings, pointing in a slightly different direction can change the outcome. I'd love your comments. Of course, please do comment, but keep in mind, I've actually used these cameras for something like a month together on the same rig at the same time, shooting exactly the same things with the same settings, same lighting, same everything, trying to create absolute baselines. Nothing can replace that experience and that data.
My approach is best in class at this tier in the market gets a 10 out of 10. Only image quality will be out of 25 points. And then the follow-up cameras will get a score commensurate with where they sit against their peers. In this segment, image quality, low light sunlight, sensor readout, and rolling shutter. We're going to start with stills, and we're going to start in direct sunlight, winter's sunlight, obviously putting each camera and sensor in their literally best light. We start with the Canon R6II, and it has a resolution of 6,000 pixels on the long edge. For the Nikon Z5II, it has 6,048 pixels on its long edge, and with the Sony a7IV, it has 7,008 pixels on its long edge. And what we're seeing here is those resolutions represented pixel for pixel. If you look up here where it says 100%, R6II at 100%, Z5II at 100%, A7IV at 100%. The difference with the Sony is more obvious because Lucia's face is slightly larger in the frame. Now, I also want to talk through my method and my process here. Of course, we had the rig where all three cameras are set up next to each other. There is less than an inch between them, probably something like 1.5 centimeters, which is half an inch, about as small as I could make it and still have wriggle room, attach cables, and continue to run the cameras as one normally would. So all of these images are offset by the difference between the sensors, which might be something like 15 centimeters or less. It's very minimal, and in the majority of shots, it's not that obvious. The other thing about the method is, of course, the camera settings were all identical. We have the same ISO, the same shutter speed, the same lens from each manufacturer where possible. And in this case, we're shooting with the 24-105 and the 24-120 from Nikon f4s. These are professional level lenses. Perhaps the Sony of the three is not a GM, but it is still a high quality lens with a price tag to match. The Nikon is actually the most affordable. The other thing, of course, is endeavoring to make the images look as much the same as possible. Of course, we're shooting RAW, so we're coming from a RAW baseline. In Capture One, we are able to have no color correction. This is chosen here under Effects, no color correction. And all of the files are in the same boat. They have no color correction. So that is what you will see for everything. Also, I have disabled the default lens correction across the board. This appears to be a global setting, which turns it off on every lens and on every picture. And if we take them back to their baseline, this is more what they look like when they come out of the camera. So just to give you a sense of, here it is. This is the base, and now we bring it back to a point of what we are more used to. So this is like shooting sort of in video, like flat or like log, somewhere in between the two. In order to bring it back to something that we more recognize, we bring the saturation up quite high and it still doesn't look oversaturated. We copy and paste those settings across the three cameras. They all have absolutely identical settings. With identical settings, we are getting a different result. Does this show the difference in sensors, the difference in color science? At this point, this is beyond my pay grade. With a bit of tweaking, we can make them all very similar, and you can see here that the only thing that seems to be changing is the color temperature. Yes, they're not identical. We could keep tweaking until we make them identical. That's the process that I go through on all the images that we look at. The settings are the same. I try to balance them for color as much as I can. Some of them we might look at in black and white just for fun. But at the end of the day, I want to show you what the system is capable of. And this is about image quality. In the best conditions, as we can see, all of these images look great. If we zoom out to the full image, there's not really a great deal to learn here. Perhaps considering we're at f4, we can look at the details as we get towards the corners. The Sony lens is sharper than the Canon lens, but neither of them are as sharp as the Nikon is right down here in the corner. And we can keep going into the corner, and the age difference between them might be 3 or 4 years, which really is not a significant amount. So there's the corners. This is the same image. ISO 100 at 1/800th of a second, f4 24 24mm. And if we go back to the center, we can see that these lenses are all sharp enough in the center, but quite a big difference on the edges. And there you go. That is what the full image looks like. We would say that they are fairly similar. But it's really interesting to me that the raw files are not the same, and the way these three companies do business is simply not the same. If we click on the Nikon and take it to 100%, just watch what the percentage marker is doing up the top there. This shows the difference in resolution. The Canon is at 101, so it has had to be zoomed just 1% more in order for these three to be able to match. To get pixel for pixel, we have to drop it back one. And then for this one, we've got to go up 13%. And that is the difference. I've always said the difference is a 13% difference, which on either side means it's a 6.5% difference on your frame either side. And where the focus point was here on this wood. We can very clearly see what's in focus, the sand is in focus, and so on. We're using the 24 to 105 at 24mm, and there's no question to me that the Nikon is the sharpest of the three, and the Canon is the softest, with the Sony somewhere in the middle. And then if we look at the fall off, the Canon seems to fall off the most. The Canon, well, that's really fussy up there in the corner, and we're starting to get chromatic aberration. The Nikon is hanging together pretty well, and the Sony, well, it's looking a bit soft as well. There is no question to me that this professional class 24 to 105 Canon is not great in the corners. It really is much softer. The Sony is doing better. There is absolutely no question that the 24 to 120 f4 from Nikon is doing the best. All the settings are the same, and all of the color adjustments and contrast adjustments are the same. So this is pretty profound to me, that to purchase a $2,000 lens, and in the US this is $1,300 USD, it's an expensive lens for what it is. It's a professional level lens. Now, I had wondered whether perhaps I have a bad copy of this lens. I purchased it new. I wouldn't expect it to happen. I've bought probably over 100 lenses in my life at this point in time, and I've never received a bad lens to the best of my ability to assess these things. Plus the kind of difference between the Sony, Nikon, and Canon. Well, you know, we've seen this sort of thing before. We certainly see this sort of thing in DSLR class lenses, and it does make me ask the question as to whether Canon stuck with their DSLR formula for this RF lens. We've seen them do that with some of their other lenses, essentially repackaging their old lens formulas. I don't know if that's true, and once this video is complete, I will be looking into getting this lens assessed because, well, I'm not impressed by this performance, especially versus what the Z24 to 120 is capable of. And here we are out in the other corner, and we can see the mountain range in the background, and we can zoom in to see what I believe is the lighthouse here. And the Canon is so soft that it has almost disappeared in this frame. In this image, I wanted to push the 24 to 105/120 to their max, and thus the Nikon is out at 120 and the other two lenses are at 105. The difference in the frame, it's not super obvious what that 15 mils gives you, but you can see it. It is there. Focus was here on this staircase. That's what we were going for, and there is pixel for pixel. So when we do get a little bit closer to it, you can see the difference in size of the staircase on the Nikon. So yes, that extra 15 mils is helpful. It does get you closer to the action. We're seeing more of the same here with the Canon. It is looking pretty soft to me in this image. If we have a look at the railing here, between here and here on the Nikon, this is all looking quite sharp and rendered very, very well. The beach is looking great. Go into 100%. The staircase was the focus point on all three of them. Nikon is doing a great job of getting the staircase and the railing behind. The Sony is doing a pretty good job, similar, not quite as sharp, but again, the Canon seems to be the softest of the three. This is really interesting to me. This is pretty jittery, and I would have thought on a tripod at 1/320th of a second, it should be stable. I don't believe this is camera shake. The camera and the lens are stabilized. Don't think this is an example of that, and I think the previous image was illustrating that as well. And quite frankly, this is just soft. There is nowhere, if we go along this wall here, it is not that nothing's in focus, it is just soft all the way through. Surprising. The idea here is to test the resolution of the sensor as well as the resolution of the lens. The part of the image we're looking at here is where the focus point was. All three cameras, regardless of the differences in resolution, are handling this quite well. We are at 100 ISO, 1/8000th of a second, f1.8. There is plenty of light. The sun has not set yet, and we've pushed these files equally, one stop with exposure, and we've lifted the shadows half a stop. This is not much of a push from my perspective, yet when we look at the Canon image and we go into 200%, there is clearly more noise, far more noise from the Canon R6II than from the Z5II or the A7IV. This shadow area, again, it's pretty clear, even with dropping this down as much as we have, and we've got a great deal of light because we are at 1/8000th of a second. Now, you might ask, why am I lifting the exposure and the shadows? That is to preserve the highlights. That's to keep the detail in any of these bright areas. This is ISO 100, base ISO for all cameras, 1/8000th of a second, f1.8. There is plenty of light. Clearly we can see purple fringing with the Canon, next to none from the Nikon, and again with the Sony we see the aberration. These lenses are different prices. The Nikon lens is about twice the price, and thus that's what you get. But I think it's pretty awesome that you can still get an affordable 50mm, which is around $500 US, and it gives you this high level of performance without having to go to the 1.4 lenses that both Canon and Sony offer. It's a great result. The grain in the Canon, the most pronounced. Nikon and the Sony are fairly similar. Let's drop this shadow down to 50. As we can see from the Nikon at 100 for shadow, you're just not getting the same noise, and this is my expectation from these cameras, to be able to push them this hard and still get this type of result, especially when we are at base ISO on all cameras. Now all three are at that 50% shadow and about 1.5 stops lifted. Very, very normal in my world, often shooting in high dynamic range situations and expecting to be able to maintain highlights very well, but also to be able to get access to those shadows if I want a texture in there. Let's go into 200%. If we push these files back to what we had before my original settings, I would say the Z5II and the A7IV are similar, and the Canon is very noisy. With both of the Canon and Sony lens, as we look on the side here, there's something going on with these 50mm lenses, which is creating this edging here, something that we're not really seeing with the Z5II. This is a pretty harsh situation, and I think that green is coming from the lens because we can also see it in the cranes behind that green. It's really not handling that very well, and we are getting all sorts of crazy artifacts there. Canon up the top, it's purple fringing on the plants and on the trees, but we are not getting that green fringing. So this is probably the differences in lenses, but to create whatever is going on in here, which we can see doesn't actually exist, this is quite interesting and quite unusual. The Nikon is very clean. And if you're wondering if we've done any defringing on any of these, they are all set to 0. Are as raw as I can make them, pushing them as I would expect to normally be able to push them as you can a Nikon file. Very noisy outcome from the Canon. This is ISO 100 across all cameras. We are at 1/250th of a second, handheld f2.8 with the 50mm. Now I've gone to 2.8 to give the more affordable 50mm lenses a fighting chance. Now what I want to show you with these images, these are based on RAWs, and what we've done is with each of them we have no color correction. If you look at the saturation across the three, they are different. I've had to push the saturation on the R6II and the A7IV much harder than on the Z5II. The Z5II files appear to have more color out of the gate, post the demosaicing process, which is basically taking the raw file and then how Capture One interpolates each individual raw file into Capture One. Each camera and each raw converter does this their own way. With color temperatures, I've tried my best to match these three files to make them look as close as possible. We have a 1-stop increase in exposure and a 50% increase in the shadow area. We can look at the noise that comes from these files in equality, and matching the color is really just to make it easier on us to see the differences, although I haven't gone to endless trouble to make them identical. The way these images were shot was handheld by using the Life Buoy at the center of the image to center each camera on, with the focus spot in the center of each EVF. 200% on each camera, and the first thing I want to note here, the difference in the resolution of the cameras based on the scale of the door and the arch. The R6II has the lowest resolution at 6,000 pixels, and thus it has the smallest arch when we are pixel for pixel. The Nikon comes in second at 6,048 pixels on the long edge and is a little bit larger. And then finally the A7IV at 7,008 pixels. It can zoom in inverted commas, the most, giving us the largest arch and the largest door. This very clearly illustrates the differences in sensor sizes when we are pixel for pixel. The next thing that's very clear here, and our settings have not changed from what I explained before, there is clearly far more grain in the R6II than in the Z5II and the A7IV. Further to that, the Z5II clearly appears to be the sharpest. The Sony, even at 2.8, is soft, or Sony are doing something different with this sensor, believing that it has more resolution, and perhaps not doing the same amount of raw adjusting to the files as they come in through the demosaicing process. It's hard to know exactly what's going on here when we are trying to make the settings identical. Also, we have the lens correction disabled. We have more noise with the R6II, we have less resolution with the R6II, to the point where the word fire is basically mixed up with resolution and noise, and really the I and the R are not overly legible, still quite legible on the Z5II and the A7IV. If we go down a little bit and look at the concrete here, and that color noise is really accentuated. Even when we're not in a dark area, it stands out on the R6II. You may use different software and it may process these files a little bit differently. I have found across all of the raw processors that I use, and that includes Adobe, Capture One, and DxO Photolab, they all do things a little bit differently. But I did look at the R6II file in Photoshop, and this noise is still present. These backlit subjects, including the windows and the wrought iron railing, R6II and A7IV display a tiny amount of purple fringing, and there does appear to be that noise still sitting in all of the shadow areas, but we can also see it in the non-shadow areas as well. The corrugated iron roof clearly has color noise through it, which we simply don't see on the Z5II and is not present in the A7IV. It's pretty surprising to me that we can see such a big difference between these files. We're not pushing them hard and we're not zooming in particularly much. Going out to 100% and that color noise is still evident in the R6II. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the difference probably here is that Canon use a front side illuminated sensor in the R6II. Nikon and Sony use backside illuminated sensors, and we know that that gives us better noise performance. And when backside illuminated sensors first arrived, at the time we were told it makes about 1 stops of difference. What's pretty surprising to me here is that at base ISO, without pushing these files very hard, how evident the difference is. This is quite profound and unexpected. I would have no problem if I saw this at 800, 1600, 3200 ISO, this sort of differential, not at base ISO. Ultimately, with this image, when we view it as we might view it on Facebook or Instagram, they all look very similar. But If you're interested in making enlargements or cropping in or pushing your files just that extra bit harder when it comes to exposure and shadows, well, we can clearly see in this demonstration which cameras are performing the best. But let's just go one step further in trying to understand how resolution affects these cameras. Let's create almost 40-inch 1-meter prints, and we look at them about as close as you can get. With thanks to Bruce from G-Clay Media, who you first met on this channel when he was showing us his Sony a7CR and a7R5 and his collection of Leica lenses. We printed out these prints, we mounted them, we looked at them, and we tried to decide which was which. This was a blind test. We didn't know.
Bruce, what do you think? We've got the Canon, the R6II, the Z5II, a7IV. They're all full frame. We've printed them 1 meter, which is over 3 feet.
Let's prove that.
There you go. There's a 1 meter ruler.
1 meter ruler, right down the bottom.
There it is.
Indeed.
Now we don't really know which is which, but even standing really close, there's nothing in it, is there, Bruce?
Well, I think if I was going to buy on the basis of camera brand, I couldn't.
Yeah, you couldn't with a resolution test, and that's what this is.
That's exactly right. From the resolution test, I certainly couldn't.
Well, I can tell you these images, there's no noise reduction. Plus, I've pulled all of the profiles out that Capture One wants to add as part of their profile. So these have been absolutely baseline, and then I've tried to match the colors, sort of, and exposures. They're a little bit different.
Well, look,
but this is a resolution test. And
it's a resolution test. It's not a color test.
But if you look here up at this wrought iron, which is probably the most detailed part,
yeah, up here.
You just can't pick it between the three.
No, you can't. You can't. And they're all using exactly the same. We printed it on exactly the same printer with exactly the same profile. And the paper that we're using is the finest in terms of grain that is in the industry.
The bottom line is whether you've got 24 megapixels, whether you've got 33 megapixels, when you're doing a 3 foot or a 1 meter print, we can't pick it.
That's exactly right.
We can't pick it.
That's exactly right. You can't pick it. You can't pick it. I mean, there are other factors that come into play.
Even when you consider this is all the 50mm 1.8s at 2.8, even the differences in the lenses don't really show in these prints.
No.
Now, when we pixel peep at 300%, we can see things. With a print like this, and let's face it, what sort of distance would you view this? A meter?
Yes. Yeah, but actually I think a bit more than a meter, right?
And then you've got no chance.
No,
you got no chance. All right, well, that concludes this part of the journey, Bruce. We're going to be doing more of these in upcoming videos. Can you tell which one's the Sony and which one's the Nikon? Interestingly, there's a 24 versus 33, but you can't see it.
Yeah. What is the percentage difference on the long axis for that?
13%. Beautiful.
I rest my case.
We've done great work, Bruce. Thank you so much for your support. For now, there you go. There you have it from the expert, Mr. Connolly here. We can't tell which camera's which. All right. Thank you.
And our final image assessment, because this could go on forever. Each image is at ISO 6400. We are at 1/15th of a second at f8 to try and make these lenses look as good as possible. We are on the 24 to 105/120. All lens corrections are turned off. All sharpening is at the same level, and there is no color correction or color profiles being added by Capture One. They have been disabled. Now, in the case of this file, we've got the same settings except for color temperature, which varies slightly between the files. There's a few things that we can look at here. Firstly, how is our noise going at 6400 ISO? Once we lift those shadows 50%, I think the a7IV looks the noisiest, but it is slightly brighter than the R6II. I think the Z5II is the least noisiest, maybe just, and it has a similar but slightly brighter than the a7IV. The mix of grain and lightness from the Z5II makes it best at 6400 ISO in the shadows. At 200% pixel for pixel, lifting the exposure one stop and the shadows half a stop, these files are looking fairly similar. I do think the Canon does have more noise up the top there. How does each camera handle the bringing down of the highlights in this very high dynamic range situation? And if we bring down the highlights the same amount on each camera, I do think there is less dynamic range in the R6II sensor. That is more blown out. We are recovering more of the highlight area from the Z5II and the A7IV. This neon sign at the top of the frame, from my perspective, the Z5II looks very sharp, very crisp, and there does appear to be less flaring going on there. We have more fidelity, more difference between light and dark inside the neon than we do on the R6II. The A7IV is sitting somewhere in the middle. Looking at this background area here, which is across the street on the other side of the road, these curtains, I think they are pretty sharp there on the Z5II, looking pretty good on the A7IV. And also, interestingly, the Canon is darker in this particular instance, which again, I think speaks to the general dynamic range of this sensor. They all seem to be capable of resolving the fine detail here on the balcony, and the way these lights at f8, they seem to be handling purple fringing pretty well. There's the slightest amount on the A7IV. The Nikon and the Canon seem to have suppressed it completely. Really interesting stuff. Image quality in video. The process of understanding image-wise what all these cameras are capable of is quite complex, because each camera company has proprietary ways of dealing with different aspects like dynamic range and how their RAW files work, and as their cameras get faster, they might drop down to 12-bit. And Canon, for example, when shooting more than 30 frames per second, does not allow for its HDR recording. Here, we are shooting at 60 frames. Conversely though, at 60 frames per second, Canon will allow for a full frame image. Sony and Nikon only allow for an APS-C 4K 60 frames per second, which is why this is the 24mm lens in APS-C to get the 60 frames across all cameras. And yes, Lucia and I are okay. So in this video, what we'll be doing, because there are so many permutations, we will be using some of the more widely used options. As I said earlier, one of the only ways to really standardize video on these three cameras is to shoot in log. This is what this footage is, and all cameras, the base ISO for log is ISO 800. From here, we're going to take a closer look at what they look like, zoomed in to 200%. There's quite a few interesting things that we can learn from these log files. Now, of course, all of the settings are the same for the cameras when it comes to shutter speed, ISO, and f-stops. The R6II is most definitely the grainiest. Another thing we can see from the R6II is that it is slightly larger in the frame, and that is due to Canon having a 1.6 times crop when in APS-C versus the Z5 and the A7IV, which have a 1.5 times crop. That is clear to see. The color clip on the left is so you can actually see how the cameras were set up, how close they are together. Now, we can pause here at any time, and when we look at Lucia's hair, the A7IV appears to be the sharpest. On the R6II, it appears that focus might have gone to the background, which is interesting because we are in APS-C, and thus we should have focus across this full area here because we're nowhere near the edges of the sensor. We'll just wait for Lucia to come back to the center of the frame, and focus has shifted on the Canon. If we look across all three images again, not much changes across the three. We're getting a pretty consistent look here. I'd say when it comes to sharpness, the R6II and the Z5II are very similar, and the A7IV is clearly the sharpest. The A7IV and R6II are shooting in 4:22. The Z5II is shooting in 4:20. There is literally less information being recorded with the Z5II. Clearly we can see the grain on the R6II. No signs of grain really on the Z5II, and the A7IV is somewhere in the middle. Sharpness is again with the A7IV. Indeed, in this particular frame, the Z5II might not be the sharpest, and remember we're at 200% here, which is the most pleasing of the three in this particular frame. For me, it's a toss-up between the sharpness and fidelity of the A7IV and perhaps the more filmic quality of the Z5II. And let's not forget, we're not exactly comparing apples with apples because the Sony has that 4:22 video in 10-bit. We can really see the noise in the R6II and the A7IV in the black areas, and I do think Nikon is probably doing a little bit of noise reduction here to minimize their noise, which might have a minuscule impact on perceived sharpness. And observe at the top here, R6II and the ocean right at the top of the frame is flickering a lot. We are not seeing that in the Z5II or the A7IV. Ultimately, what we learn from observing this is all of these cameras are giving us an amazing result when you think about the price that you pay, that you can shoot 4K 60 frames per second in 10-bit log and get these amazing files. But there are differences. And if we just go back and look at my jacket there, it's fairly clear which is grainiest, which is least grainy, and I would say the Z5II, which displays the least grain, I think that grain is being mitigated by a little bit of noise reduction. The absolutely amazing Lucia braving the cold 9-degree day, and with wind chill it must have been 4 degrees plus cold water. A true champion. What we're looking at here is each camera at their base ISO with the color profiles that I tried to make as flat as possible. And then I have added color and contrast in post. When we look at these cameras at 100 ISO, at 10-bit, not in log, they do seem to all perform very well. Although in this particular situation, I would like to say that Nikon's flat profile, again, is the most useful and the most flexible, and I find it to be the most pleasing file to work from when I'm trying to edit these files. With each of these camera systems, there is an enormous array of customization available for creating flat profiles, and the scope of this video did not allow for a deep dive into those. I will create a follow-up video for optimizing each of these systems for color and codecs in video. When it comes to rolling shutter, I think these cameras are working fairly similarly. Although what I think I can see is that the in-body image stabilization does impact the rolling shutter because it takes up some of the speed. Either way, they're all pretty similar. Ultimately, image quality is made up of so many factors. Clearly the R6II offers the lowest quality of the three, and that's probably largely due to that front-side illuminated sensor. Then it's a tussle between the A7IV and the Z5II. From my perspective, the Z5II takes the lead due to the lens selection available in this particular test. So this score is based on these particular test parameters. And ultimately, when we think about the majority of use cases that people use images for these days, plus the print test that we performed, there really is no clear or outstanding advantage. And ultimately, it comes together in the package, and image quality is about the whole package. Autofocus, sunlight, low light, and action. First, in autofocus, we are going to look at video, and you can see straight off here that the Sony is out of focus. The a7IV is not seeing Lucia. I am not touching any of the cameras once I press record. They are all on their widest focus areas, and they all have face and eye detect engaged. I'm not touching them. I'm just letting them run. So this is what you'd expect if you were also a content creator doing this on your own. Z5II is most definitely in focus, and I think the Canon might be a little bit soft. It seems to look a little bit more into the distance than the a7IV when it's not sure where focus is. Z5II stays locked, and you can watch here as Lucia is running in. It's out of focus, out of focus, out of focus, and any second, there you go, in focus. A7IV just simply is not face recognizing at the same sort of distance. We can see by this point they are all looking sharp. A7IV, Z5II look sharp, there's no question through this area here, and R6II lost focus because Lucia got to the edge of frame. In this video, I want you to keep an eye on the face and body detection boxes. And if you watch very closely, the Nikon is keeping the person in focus. A7IV is already out of focus if you look at the top right, and there's no recognition. The Nikon is still recognizing a body. Neither the Canon or the Sony are recognizing anything. And if you look up the top, they're both out of focus. Nikon is still in focus. Still the recognition, still in focus. A7IV is out of focus. I'm not really sure what the Canon is doing. And then if we look here, the Sony is about to kick in. Same method as before. I'm not touching the cameras. You can literally see the cameras here in the bottom of the frame. This tells us that the Z5II can see humans much further away in frame. This test is showing us the same. So we did a night test, a day test, and I can tell you I ran each of these tests about 10 times. Z5II has got a box on the back of Lucia's head. Neither of the other two cameras have done that. Staying in focus. Now what you'll see here is the A7IV will fall out of focus as Lucia walks further away. The A7IV has no box. The R6II has a box. It's very hard to see, but it's there on the back of Lucia's head. And she turns around. R6II box has now disappeared. There is no box on the Sony. Tell her to go further. You can see the Sony has now changed focus to the background, and the background is in focus if you look at the waves and the shoreline, and Lucia is most definitely out of focus now on the A7IV. Z5II still has a recognition box on Lucia's face. R6II and Z5II are in focus. Now keep an eye on the Sony on the right because the Canon and the Nikon are staying in focus. The Sony is out of focus. It will pull focus. Gets a little bit of focus, and there we go. It's into focus now. So it is definitely not seeing objects as far away. As we fly through this area here, both the Canon and the Sony are soft and the Nikon is not. It's actually the sharpest. And you might go, well, it's to do with the lens or something else. But we can see here, when we slow this part down, which we will do, they can get sharp. Got buffeting due to the high wind, but if we watch Lucia as she heads away from the camera, focus looks pretty similar. If you have a look at the earring there on the right-hand side, I would say it looks pretty similar, probably just a little bit softer on the Canon, ever so slightly sharper on the Sony due to that downsampling. Now keep an eye on the box here. It appears for the Z5 in the middle. We can see the box here, and we'll just keep cruising along until we see the box appear. Now it appears on the Canon as she walks away. It never appears on the Sony. Now there it is appearing on the Canon. Here it is here. If we look at these three, they still all look sharp. The Sony looks really sharp. If we look at Lucia's hair here, definitely sharp. Definitely sharp, but slightly softer, and that might be due to that 7K oversampling instead of the 6K. Plus, A7IV and R6II, when in certain modes, offer 422 video, whereas the Z5II only offers 420. 422 samples color information at a higher rate, and that gives us a richer and more detailed image. Further, when I look at the data rate of each camera, the R6II, when in this mode, is 340 megabits per second. The Nikon is only 42 megabits per second, and the Sony is 98 megabits per second. It's striking to me that the Canon has such a massive file size due to this, but it's giving us the lowest quality. The Nikon's doing a pretty good job of keeping up with the Sony, yet it has half the file size. This is really interesting stuff and further shows how different these camera manufacturers do video. Now we'll just keep letting Lucia walk away. Now we can see the Nikon is still finding focus, as is the Canon. If we look down in the circles, the Sony is not. They all appear to be in focus, the Canon still being the softest. I think we've got focus, although here I think the Canon might be just starting to get soft. Its box has disappeared here on Lucia's face. The Sony is not registering the face, but it is still in focus. Now it's hard to say why the Nikon is still registering the face and still in focus. All right. I pushed Lucia a little bit further away just to see what would happen. The Sony has jumped to the background. So just watch the waves on the right-hand side here. We can see somewhere in here it'll jump from her. And it's basically when she turns around here. That's where it's losing her and going to the background. The Nikon's still in focus, but clearly the Sony has gone to the background. We're getting a lot of wind buffeting. Lucia is out of focus in the A7IV and in the R6II at this point. It's just generally soft. The Z5II is still in focus, and you can see that the focus box in the middle circle down the bottom is still focused. The A7IV is on the background and she is soft. The R6II, I'm not sure what it's doing. It's somewhere between soft and not soft, but I don't think it's finding focus. Now we just saw the Sony here do a little bit of a pulse from out of focus, in focus, back out of focus. It's working on it, but did not recognize her and did not maintain focus. The Canon maybe has found some sort of focus, but it's either soft lens, soft focus, or just softer codec. Hard to say. Okay, so we're just going to go through this slowly. The Nikon continues to be in focus, which we can see it is the most focused of these three. It is Nikon, Canon, Sony in that order at the moment. And now Lucia is looking up. She is still out of focus on the A7IV. Still out of focus on the A7IV, in focus on the Nikon, soft on the Canon. And you can see here, this is just where it finds her. Background, then to her. Background to her. Nikon is staying in focus. Canon is just soft. I suspect it's not changing from the background. Now we see here the Sony loses focus. Focused, and then it goes soft somewhere in here. Back to the background. The Nikon maintains focus. And then all three cameras maintain focus from here. Canon remains soft. The Sony is looking the sharpest now due to its sensor, and the Nikon is still in focus. And when she's actually moving, they all look pretty good, but I would say the Canon is just simply softer. A7IV and the Z5II are both in focus. There are different levels of sharpness which could be caused by all sorts of things. It's hard to say. Interestingly, the Sony comes across as perhaps sharper, but kind of softer. Even so, face and eye recognition are on all cameras. The Canon is clearly the softest. I would say that the Z5II, A7IV are both sharp or sharp enough. Canon is most definitely softer. Now here we might say that the Z5II is looking sharpest if we look at eyelashes. I'm not sure what the Sony's doing here. I don't believe I had any skin softening going on. Is this to do with critical focus, and is it more on the earring? And of course the Canon continues to be soft. Is that on the earring with the Sony and not on the eye? I would say the Z5II is the sharpest now on the eye. These lenses, there's the Canon, and it can be sharp. That's definitely sharp on the eye. The Nikon is definitely sharp on the eye, and the Sony can also be sharp on the eye. What was going on in those previous frames just back here? The Sony looked softer. It looks soft. Why does the Nikon basically have more detail here than the Sony? We go through to this other shot. They all basically have the same levels of detail. And that just simply might be that they are not maintaining critical focus when she's running towards the camera, because that is sharp now on her eyes and eyebrows. Very interesting to me. If we were to average out the results of this particular shot, and I did test these things over and over again, night and day, over 30 times, the results were the same sort as what we see here. The average across this whole run in and run out, Z5II definitely tracks and maintains focus the best. A7IV is next. R6II is last. Now, as a reminder, we talked at the start of this video about the age of these cameras, and yes, they are different ages. Absolutely true. But this video is not about their age. This video is about if you go into a camera store and ask for the professional level 35mm entry level camera, and one of the components to do that is, for example, in-body image stabilization and 2 card slots. These are the cameras that are available from each manufacturer. That is why we have this list. When the R6III comes out or the A7IV comes out, this will all change again and we will test it again. But this is what you can buy today if those are your parameters. And it's really interesting to me that the Nikon Z5II, which is a very affordable camera, is actually delivering such a strong result. When there's a lot of conversation around Nikon's autofocus capabilities, yet what I'm seeing here is with these cameras that are at the same level in the market, this is what you can buy today if you ask for those parameters. It's clearly doing very, very well.
In-body image stabilization, photography and video.
R6II, A7IV both have in-body image stabilization as well as stabilization within the lens. The Z5II is IBIS only. R6II 8 stops, Z5II 7.5 stops, Sony a7IV 5.5 stops. Now we can see that the Z5II and the A7IV look pretty similar most of the time, and the R6II is the smoothest, but I think they're doing a pretty reasonable job considering we are just on the standard level. But remember, the Sony has got stabilization in the lens as well as in the body. The fact that the Z5II is keeping up completely, I think that's pretty cool. We did get the odd jitter in the R6II if you go back and watch. But that's a pretty good result across all of these lenses. This is the 24-105 and the 24-120 Nikon. Now we're on the 50mm 1.8s, and we can see that the A7IV is definitely the most jittery. Z5II is coming in second, and I would say the R6II is the smoothest most of the time, but not all of the time. But pretty much it is top to bottom, best to least best. It's quite interesting to see how each camera reacts a little bit differently. They have slightly different algorithms. They're pretty close to the same. Now another opportunity to look at rolling shutter, and again we can see the 3 cameras are very, very similar. Another little walk here, and I would say once again it's top to bottom, best to least best. This test, 3 cameras being tilted, as you can see. Now, if you look at the Nikon in the middle, sometimes it just stays pretty much still while the other 2 are jittering around. This is all being shot. You can see exactly my movements, but just watch how that Z5II is able to stay smooth while the other 2 move. and it's the only one that doesn't have stabilization in the lens. It's absolutely amazing, and I'm just playing this clip again so you can just see, you can get a chance to look at the difference and what the Z5II is capable of. From my perspective, it's pretty impressive. It's sort of like a tripod mode when you're standing still. This is me taking a photograph handheld of the images that you saw earlier in this video. This is what they look like further out. R6II on the top, Z5II in the middle, A7IV at the bottom. The order has always been top to bottom, left to right in this video, simply for alphabetical reasons. That's it. 1 second, f8 on the 50mm 1.8. f8 really should get them all at a very good degree of sharpness, but we're not getting into diffraction territory, which starts around f11 on a 24 megapixel sensor. So this really should be the sweet spot. What I did was I took 4 shots at 1 second, half a second, quarter of a second, and 1/8 of a second. Total of 16 shots for each camera. Shortlisted the ones which seemed to be most stable and basically kept getting slower shutters until I simply could not get a very good hit rate at all. This is sort of where it stops, around the 1 second mark, where you can still get Canon and Nikon. 1 out of the 4 shots that I took, I got something vaguely usable. The A7IV there at the bottom is a little bit more jittery. Now that's the middle of the frame. If we go over to the edges, the stabilization gets more exaggerated as to how successful it is or not. We can see the Sony is definitely losing its way on the edge there. Z5II is a little bit softer, and the Canon seems to be best here on the left. But if we go over to the other side, A7IV down the bottom there is even worse. Z5II looks the best. R6II is definitely coming in second. R6II and Z5II, you could probably get away with 1 second if you took a few shots. The thing that I really need to stress here is this is handheld. So whether I'm absolutely guaranteed to do exactly the same amount of movement or not movement, employing the best field craft that I have, cannot be guaranteed. So this is a test that's based on averages, and that's simply how we're working it out. But because the results were the same across 1 second, half a second, quarter of a second, the cameras came out in roughly the same order. And by the time the R6II and the Z5II got to around 1/8 of a second, somewhere between a quarter and an eighth of a second, pretty much every shot is a good one. Whereas the A7IV, even a 1/8, every shot was not the best. So basically, from a low light, low shutter speed perspective, I think the Z5II and R6II are pretty similar. I do think the Z5II has it by a hair, but the Canon is very, very close. Certainly the Sony is behind. Now, technically, the Sony specs are 5.5 stops officially. Z5II is 7.5 stops. R6II is 8 stops of stabilization. The point about that is once you start going that far, is it even possible to defy physics? Well, yes, these images are all captured at 1 second, and, you know, they're pretty awesome results. I was freestanding here. I wasn't leaning against anything. This is just fully standing up. I'm pretty impressed that you can get this at 1 second with a 50mm. Of course, it will change with different lenses. And finally, at 105mm or 120mm when you are on the Z5II, the R6II is at the bottom. When it comes to this lens, both the Sony and the Canon have optical stabilization within the lens as well as within the camera, and they are supposed to work together. Now again, I took multiple images to try and get the best result across multiple exposures. This is the best that I was able to achieve after taking a number of images. It's a little bit surprising to me that both of the optically stabilized lenses that have IBIS as well seem to be actually performing the worst. It's a little bit different in video. It's surprising to me. I don't really understand. I would absolutely believe that there are different algorithms for video versus stills. So I get that. And we saw in the video test that the Sony, this same lens, was able to keep up with the Nikon. Even so, the Nikon does not have any stabilization in this lens. And the Canon was doing the best in that walking test. When it comes to this handheld test at quarter of a second, and I don't believe it's to do with soft focus, because again, I saw these results results over and over again. For example, if we look at a wide angle image from the Canon at 1 second here, this is wide angle, handheld, and we go 1 second, all these 1 second images. It just couldn't do it. Half a second, just not hanging together. Quarter of a second, it's starting to get tight. So this is at 24mm. Whereas if we look at the Nikon, taking that same shot, here it is here, we are at 100%. There is 1 second. The Nikon is capable at 1 second of getting things in focus. Both at 24mm and at 105mm, this 24-105 L-class lens from Canon, very intriguing lens to me because it's not optically good and the stabilization also seems to be a little bit variable, works better in video, that's for sure, than in stills. There's 1 second for the Sony, another 1 second, half a second, pretty good, half a second, pretty good. So the Sony has done better at the 24 end of the spectrum, most definitely, than the Canon did at the 24. There is a higher hit rate. There's a quarter that's a little bit off, but there's a quarter that's in. Look, they're kind of all over the place, but when it comes to the Nikon, from a stills perspective, across the board, the Nikon is definitely achieving the best result.
Heat management. Video 4K 10-bit 420 24 frames. Full frame.
I had no idea what to expect with these three cameras, trying to get the codecs, frame rates, bit rates, everything as standard as possible. But I was surprised to see after just 22 minutes, the Sony stopped. I gave it a little rest, I started it again, and within another 10 minutes or so, it had stopped. This pattern repeated. I did give it a rest here and there, as you can see. This was about a 10-minute rest. Gave it another go, and then very, very quickly, yet again, it would overheat. And this pattern occurred. We're up to the third time, fourth time. All three cameras have the same focus mode set, and the temperature in the room is around 21 degrees centigrade or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This is all just very average baseline testing. Here we keep going, fifth time. And as we can see, the other cameras keep going, sixth time, seventh time, eighth time, ninth time. And obviously the Sony is not cooling down. Gave it another long break of about 10 minutes and it just simply kept turning off. What surprised me greatly is these cameras are doing the same work. They're doing exactly the same work. It's 4K, 24 frames per second, 10-bit. The R6II Z5II had absolutely no problem running. The battery ran out at about 158 on the Canon. The Z5II kept going for approximately another 10 minutes, and just like the R6II, showed no sign at all of overheating. Here we are watching the last minute or so as the battery runs out. And because the Nikon has a 2-hour and 5-minute recording limit, I did have to stop and restart it, which I did very quickly. When it comes to heat management, clearly Canon R6II, Nikon Z5II are doing something very differently to the A7IV. If you need to do long recording, then the A7IV is probably not the choice. Now, with all of these cameras, none of them were set to their higher heat levels. The idea was to create this particular baseline. And of course, we would get more out of the Sony, but anecdotal research that I have conducted even shows with that extended heat settings, car doors open, battery bays open, and so on, it still will not perform like the R6II and the Z5II. No question. Basically, what we get here is a win for these two cameras when it comes to heat in this particular test. And this is where I talk about variables. This is one test, and you could conduct tests at every temperature level from 10 degrees up to 40 degrees centigrade. You could conduct it in the sun, out of the sun, doors open, doors closed. There are so many permutations simply testing heat, let alone changes in codecs.
Stills, frame rates, and focus acquisition.
Action, frame rates, and focus speed go hand in hand. Here we are testing Joe on his bike.
Great job.
This test is not for color and it's not for lens corrections or camera corrections. This is about autofocus, and part of autofocus is lens quality and sharpness. We can see relative difference within the lenses here in this test. What this test was Joe riding at 30 kilometers per hour, pretty much directly at the camera, and I put all of them into their best AF tracking modes and shot them at their maximum speed that they could shoot with a shutter, because all of these cameras, when moving to electronic shutter, do display rolling shutter. And because all of them are relatively fast, the A7IV is the slowest, doing 14-bit at 6 frames per second, but we dropped it to its 12-bit option, which is 10 frames a second. It's the slowest with a mechanical shutter. R6II and Z5II are just a couple of frames faster each. And we start around this tuft of grass just to show you the full size of the frame. We're at 105 mils, ISO 400, 1250th at f4. This should be more than fast enough to freeze the action, give us a little bit of depth of field, give us a little bit of compression as Joe comes pretty close to my position. We go into pixel for pixel and you can watch the camera. It maintains focus. The focus is not going anywhere else. We step through these frames and we can see that focus is maintained, and it's absolutely maintained on Joe's face. Interestingly, the front frame here does seem to be a little bit soft, but I just simply think that's due to the nature of this lens, which is sharpest in the middle and then falls off towards the edges. At 12 frames per second, Joe keeps coming, and we can see that focus is keeping up with him absolutely. Again, this is pixel for pixel, no problem. Doesn't really seem to change the look that we're getting. That one's probably a little bit softer, back into focus again, but that might be one frame across quite a number. That's slightly softer. Ultimately, a great result. I manually dialed in 105 because the lens is 120. Pixel for pixel just definitely looks sharper to me. I believe this is to do with differences in the lens, which is, again, I've talked about this in another section. I'm pretty surprised because these two lenses, the 24-105 L series Canon and the 24-120 S series Nikon, they're both almost exactly the same price, but there does seem to be a very big difference in quality, which is just a huge surprise to me because in this country, they're $2,000 lenses, and you'd expect more in the mirrorless era with that massive mount for the Z and the RF. If you look at the settings, they are both ISO 400, 1/1250 f4. They're just completely different results, yet the lenses are the same price. But one looks soft. Even so, it maintains this level as Joe tracks towards me on the R6II. It is just chalk and cheese result. A reminder that Joe has a speedo on his bike and he's doing 30 kilometers per hour with each run. Shooting in RAW. You can even make out the motion in Joe's tires, even so the shutter is at 1/1250th. And so far every frame is rock solid. And just look at the detail on Joe's bike. If you look down at the suspension area and his face, everything is rock solid. This is f4. We would absolutely be expecting that. And you can just see how big the full frame is. Pixel for pixel, staying sharp. That one, there might be a slight difference in that one, just like we saw in the Canon. Sharp, 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 sharp. So there might have been one frame that wavered, if you're lucky, and the wavering was so minor, most people wouldn't tell. The Sony does look sharper than the Canon, but definitely not sharper than the Nikon. This is the Nikon at the top, Sony at the bottom. I'm just leaving it as the manufacturer default as Capture One, or Sony has stipulated what it should look like. Clearly see the 24-120 S-Class Nikon is sharper. Nothing special being done here, just using the Pro standard for the Sony, the Pro standard for the Z5II. This is just all just out of the box normal. Like the other two cameras, Focus is maintained. No question, it just seems to be a little softer. We can see here that the A7IV is definitely maintaining focus. That's absolutely true. Does it lose focus anywhere along the way? Not yet, anyway. So what we can take from this is all cameras are maintaining focus, and it's the lenses that are giving us slightly different results. R6II buffer size allows for 12 frames per second at 14-bit RAWs, and we get to around 100 images before we stop. This is in mechanical shutter. The buffer takes about 20 seconds to clear with that V90 SD UHS-2 card. Electronics a different story, which we'll talk about at the end of this section. Z5II, when shooting 14 frames per second 12-bit RAWs, we get a set 200 images with mechanical shutter. The buffer clears in 1 to 2 seconds using that same V90 card. We get 1 frame more in electronic, but it's much the same outcome. A7IV, we're shooting 10 frames per second 12-bit RAWs. We get 220 to 230 images in mechanical and electronic shutter. The buffer takes 3 to 4 seconds to clear, and that is with me using the latest Gen 4 CF Express Type A cards.
There you go, that is the focus test, speed test. It's all done. By the look of looking at 100% in the EVs, the cameras do look similar, but I'll only know the true results when I look on my 30-inch monitor. All cameras, considering all the differences, they're all doing really well.
Z5II is fastest when it comes to mechanical shutter. R6II is fastest when it comes to electronic shutter. Now, whether you can use that all the time or not is up to you, because there are rolling shutter issues. But overall, the Sony is the slowest across both electronic and mechanical. When it comes to stills, autofocus, and the tests that I conducted here, all cameras are behaving pretty much exactly the same. Stills buffer depth, after double and triple checking each of these metrics with the cards that you saw, these are the results.
Video specifications.
As we've had such an in-depth look at picture quality and autofocus ability, the rest of these categories are going to move much quicker. When it comes to video specs, the cameras are very similar. Of course, the Sony has that tiny bit more resolution, which does seem to bear fruit here and there. But ultimately, it is the Z5II's ability to shoot internal, raw, 12-bit video that allows it to take the lead. The Sony a7IV comes in second due to its oversampling in both full-frame 4K and in APS-C 4K. The Canon, it comes in the lowest position due to its very noisy footage / noisy sensor. To highlight a few other facts about the R6II, it is capable of shooting 180 frames per second in 1080p at 8-bit. It's also the only camera of the three that can shoot 4K 60 frames per second in full frame. Another pretty cool trick the R6II has up its sleeve is video pre-roll. 3 to 5 seconds, but not in all codecs. When it comes to the HDMI output, all the cameras are very similar, and they can get raw out of their HDMI ports. This is outside the parameters I set for this video, which was what is all internal. It's pretty amazing that the Nikon Z5II is offering internal RAW, and yet it is the most affordable camera in this list. A little bit of a side note, the best way to get the most out of that RAW is to shoot in Super 35 / APS-C mode.
Dual card video recording.
This is simply something that the Z5II is incapable of, yet both the R6II and the Sony a7IV can record to both of their slots. Interestingly, because the Sony a7IV has the CF Express Type A and the UHS-2 slot, it means it can't record those higher end bit rates and frame rates to that SD card. The Canon wins because all codecs and frame rates can go to both card slots. Firmware support. When it comes to firmware and these three companies, there is no doubt since the launch of the Z series of cameras that Nikon has provided more firmware updates with more features than either Canon or Sony. Further to that, we have seen both Canon and Sony release firmware updates that have, on very rare occasions, introduced bugs and removed features. Clearly today, Nikon is ahead when it comes to firmware. The mounts, E-mount, R-mount, Z-mount, explained. Mounts are a really important part of any camera system and they last for decades. Sony E-mount has a diameter of 46.1 millimeters with a flange distance of 18 millimeters. Canon RF mount has a diameter of 54 millimeters with a flange distance further away at 20 millimeters. And Nikon is both the largest and the closest. That has its advantages, a diameter of 55 millimeters and a distance of 16 millimeters. What does the largest and closest mean? Well, not only does it give great opportunity for optical design, but it also makes the mount the most adaptable. Being this adaptable means the Z mount can do something that the RF and the E mount can't do. The Z mount can attach both Z mount lenses as well as E mount lenses and get full functionality out of both. That means the Z mount has access to everything this Sony E mount does, along with everything the Z mount has access to. For today's modern cameras, it would be the most accessible mount, with the largest range of lenses available. The Canon comes third in this video for two reasons. One, the opening size is larger than the Sony, but it is further away from the sensor by 2 millimeters. The second reason is for the foreseeable future, the RF appears to be the most closed mount by far. EVFs. In the EVF race, the Canon and the Sony are the fastest at 120 Hertz, but I'm just not sure how often that really impacts what we shoot. And the fact that the Z5II is the brightest by a fair margin that I can see by my eye, but I cannot find any specifications online regarding it, that would seem to impact all users shooting in dark and sunlight situations. Also, the Canon comes across as the lowest quality. The Sony does feel sharp, but the Nikon feels more natural. So it takes the win. Digital hot shoes, yes or no? Yes, both Canon and Sony have digital hot shoes, which allows for digital audio direct into the camera and perhaps some flash options. But there is anecdotal evidence that these electronic hot shoes are susceptible to moisture ingress. So ultimately, are they a pro or a con? Canon state on their own website, to ensure adequate weather sealing, the supplied shoe cover should be used unless a weather-sealed accessory is inserted in the multi-function shoe. Due to the Z5 being able to perform much the same functions, yes, in a less elegant way, it doesn't mean it's a zero for the Z5. Due to the elegance of the multi-function shoe and the fact that this is what this parameter is about, the two cameras get a 10 and the Nikon only gets a 5. But we can't forget that that is a potential weak point of the camera, as is stated by Canon. It must be ensured that that multi-function hot shoe is sealed against the weather. Card slots. The R6II, Z5II and A7IV all have 2 times UHS Type 2 slots for SD cards. The Sony, one of those slots can also double as a CF Express Type A slot. Sony are the only company to use CF Express Type A, to the best of my understanding. Now, the advantage of the CF Express Type A is it is a much faster card slot. And there are only a few of Sony's higher-end codecs with higher-end frame rates that require the speed of the CF Express Type A. The problem there is, though, if you decide you want dual card recording, you can only do it to one card on those higher end codecs. And thus, due to the fact that the Canon is the only camera that gives you usage of its two slots all of the time for both stills and video, it takes the win. All three cameras allow recording of stills to both cards. Lenses, first party, third party, and adapted. When it comes to lenses, the race is fairly clear to me. Yes, all camera manufacturers offer high quality lenses. Perhaps in the case of this video, some of these lenses from some of these manufacturers are not the best that they offer. Yes, Sony has more native E-mount lenses than Canon and Nikon, which are very close to each other in their number count. But the fact that Nikon can mount all E-mount lenses along with an enormous array of other lenses, including Fuji XF lenses, that both E-mount and RF mount can't mount, there's clearly no question here that the Nikon Z5II can mount more lenses than the Canon R6II or the Sony a7IV. But it's more than that. It's also the enormous array of extraordinarily high-class Z-mount lenses, which includes lenses like the 35-50 and 85 1.2, the Plena, along with the extraordinary telephoto lenses that we've seen from Nikon over the last 2 or 3 years. Nikon takes lenses. Ergonomics. Ergonomics, from my perspective, is about two things. It's about comfort and comfort over time, as well as usability. Now, it's really interesting how different these three cameras are, yet they all do the same thing. They all have very much similar functionality, but gosh, do these manufacturers do it differently. Sony, from my perspective, and I have owned the very first of alpha cameras, the Sony A7R. They have always been too small, and it is only now in the very modern era of the A9 III and the A12 that it seems that Sony's have become large enough. Still, in the A7IV era, as this camera is around about 3.5 years old, the camera from my perspective is too small between the grip and lenses, especially lenses like the 24 to 105 f4, which on my A7 III, when I took it to Europe for a month, it rubbed on my fingers the whole time I was doing street photography. For people with large hands, these cameras are a tight fit. But there's more to ergonomics than simply the feel. There is also the function. Nikon is the only camera that has two function buttons on the front of the camera beside the lens, and these buttons sit exactly where your fingers are sitting when you're holding the grip. The R6II has one function button in that position, and the A7IV has none. What it does have there is the lens release button, which is perhaps why Sony only recently put one button in that position, and it's a fairly long way away from that lens release position. It's counterintuitive from my perspective for them to have put the lens release on that side, because you won't be releasing lenses whilst you're shooting, but that's what Sony has. Also, other ergonomics includes where are the power buttons on these cameras. When it comes to the Z5II and the A7IV, the power button is on the shutter button. They are in the same position. So turning the camera on and off one-handed very quickly as you take it from your side up to your eye is easy and instantaneous. This is not as easy with the R6II, as the on-off switch is on top of the camera. Now, it is something that you get more used to, but it is still not as seamless and as easy and swift as the other two cameras. Another thing to think about with Canon is they seem to move the power switch around. And on the original R6, the power switch was on the other side of the EVF. in an even more difficult position. Who's to say whether Canon will move the power again? It's something that does not seem to have a standard position, like with the Nikon and the Sony, across all their cameras. Canon simply don't do it. Another switch which I think is in the wrong position on the R6II, but is in better positions on the Z5II and a7IV, is the switch that takes us between video and stills. I think the Nikon one is the easiest to use as it's under your thumb. The Sony one, you have to use your forefinger, your trigger finger, so you have to take your finger off the trigger to change it. And the Canon one is on completely the other side of the camera, next to the EVF. Now, this is not going to impact all people because some people may not flip between video and stills all the time. My use case, I'm constantly doing it, and the position it's in on the Z5II seems most optimized for speed and ease of use without taking your hand from the shooting position. There is just simply so much to ergonomics, including weight. And here is the weight of these three cameras, which is pretty similar and I don't think worth talking about. As we look at ergonomics, we can see some things are objective, but a lot of it is subjective, down to use case and how you use your camera, the size of your hands, the level of dexterity that you have. Do you have to wear gloves? And were you trained to use a camera in the 1970s, 80s, noughties, 10s? Because this will change the buttons that we are more familiar with, and thus there are just so many permutations in the ergonomics and how people use their cameras. Further to that, in this video we just simply can't cover all ergonomic aspects of these cameras. There's a number of things that I just haven't talked about. For example, the angle of which the shutter trigger is at, along with the placement of the forward and back dials, which I think can be optimal in order to decrease or increase fatigue when you use these buttons and dials a lot, which someone like me, I use them all the time.
Color science.
Color science is a pretty brief one. If we shoot in RAW or we shoot in log in video, we are able to get the colors where we need them to be. It's in JPEG and in our 8-bit and 10-bit non-log files where color science matters. And from my perspective, the Nikon out of the box gets the color science right with very little effort. Nikon takes the win.
Pixel shift.
The a7IV and the R6II do not have pixel shift. The Z5II does. What this allows for is your 24 megapixel sensor to go up to 96 megapixels when shooting on a tripod still subjects. So this is amazing for certain use cases. Not only do you get improved resolution, but you also get improvements in color and noise reduction. Pixel shift is a win for the Z5.
Weather sealing.
As we discussed, the digital hot shoes do seem to be a potential weak spot when it comes to weather sealing. Other than that, all cameras appear to be professionally weather sealed, and they all have exactly the same operating temperature, 0 through to 40 degrees Celsius, or 32 Fahrenheit up to 104 Fahrenheit. But because of Nikon's robust weather sealing and no potential for ingress via a digital shoe, Nikon takes the win.
Pre-capture.
Pre-capture is pretty straightforward. R6II offers half a second of RAW, Z5II offers 1 second of JPEG, and the Sony a7IV offers nothing. Canon for the win.
User interface.
When it comes to how you interface with the user interface, this will change your opinion of each of the three systems. I use the multifunction joystick to move around the screen. Others may well do most of their settings via touchscreens, of which they all have. If you use touchscreens, then maybe Canon takes the win by a hair. If you use the multi-select joystick, then the Canon is a bit more complicated. It does not have submenus within submenus like the Z5II and A7IV. At the end of the day, they're all pretty similar, but if you were choosing between the Z5II and the A7IV, the Z5II has the largest and easiest to read font. And finally, let's talk about the sandboxing of settings between video and stills. A7IV seems to sandbox very little at all. In other words, you don't have two separate states. Z5II, R6II seem to sandbox pretty much everything. Strangely, the Z5II seems to sandbox a great deal, except for color temperature. I did not check all settings, there may be some other ones, but all of the other main settings like shutter and aperture and focus modes, they are sandboxed. It's just that color temperature. Again, for the R6II, the major ones are sandboxed, including color temperature. So that's a win for the R6II when it comes to sandboxing. Z5II comes in extremely closely, and well, the A7IV just simply doesn't seem to do it.
Battery life, video and stills.
When it comes to video, and I ran this test a couple of times, basically the Z5II lasted the longest, just a little bit longer than the R6II, but it was only something like a 10% difference. At the time that I stopped using the Sony, there was 36% left in the battery, but the Sony had probably been off more than 36% of the time. Based on these outcomes, I would say the cameras are fairly similar, but it looks like the Nikon Z5II lasts just that little bit longer. Ultimately, the heavy lifting when it comes to video and what uses power and also generates heat is probably creating the compression along with the sensor being on for extended periods of time. Other aspects which impact battery life include the autofocus system, which was the same on all cameras, as well as the monitor on the back of the camera. And of course, writing that data to the cards. But I would have thought that's handled pretty similarly across these three cameras. So why do you get different results? Well, I think mostly it's probably to do with the efficiency of the processors, how hot they're running and how much power they have to use. Because interestingly, the Nikon's done the best on the video test, but when it comes to stills, the SEPA rating is lowest on the Nikon. But of course, SEPA ratings are not the greatest of guide, and in the real world, it would probably be different. I didn't do real-world testing. Ultimately, my opinion on battery life for stills is you tend to get something like 2 to 3 times more than what SEPA says. In the modern mirrorless era, you're probably leaving home with at least 2 batteries. Or what I do is I always have a USB-C PD power supply, and I just simply plug a right angle cable into the camera and it can just keep charging if and when I need it to, or if I have a break. And this works really well. One more point about battery life is about battery charging. With one of my small rig batteries, it has 2 USB-C PD delivery ports on it. And on its display, it shows how much power it is putting out. 9.2 volts goes to the Z5II and the A7IV, but only 5.2 volts go to the R6II. This bore out by multiple recharges. The Canon R6II takes, well, almost twice as long to charge via the USB-C port.
Connectivity.
When it comes to connectivity, all of these cameras are very similar. But we will talk about the differences, which lie in USB-C charging, HDMI, the multi-interface shoe, and in Bluetooth speeds. The Canon R6II seems to charge slower at 5.2 volts. All 3 cameras support USB power delivery, known as the PD standard. They can be charged when the cameras are off or when the cameras are being used. Both the R6II and the Z5II have micro HDMI ports, whereas the A7IV has a full-sized port. The multi-interface shoe is something that I've talked about before. The fact that the Nikon hot shoe is less functional, and that is specifically what this category is about, it does lose slightly there on that front. And then finally, the Sony is slightly slower when it comes to Bluetooth. These largely minor differences will not affect the majority of use cases or the majority of users that will purchase these cameras. Build quality. When it comes to build quality, I think this is partly objective and partly subjective. Because the way materials feel, the way they behave, the way they act, that can influence our opinion on what the quality is. So from that baseline, I'll give you my very best. Both the Canon R6II and the Nikon Z5II have rubberized grips. The A7IV has a hard plastic grip. I prefer the rubberized grip. It's a little bit softer and a little bit easier to hold on to. Now, what does this mean about build quality? It being more comfortable and more friendly gives me the sense of quality. Which will last longer? I don't know. I think both of them, having owned cameras for tens of years, it's likely both of them will last as long as they need to. A next area I noticed some difference was the hinge on the rear screens that flip out. The Z5II has the tallest, the longest hinge, which means there is more of a connection between the camera and the screen via that hinge. Thus, I would say the quality of that hinge, if all materials are considered equal, will be higher. Also, the Z5II has the largest screen. Now, again, build quality. Is this specifically quality? Well, it also has the best resolution. Let's go round to the rubber port covers on the side, and when it comes to what is the intention of these port covers? Well, there's two parts to it, I suppose. One is usability, and the other one is functionality. In other words, these port covers, from my perspective, are there to seal the ports from any type of ingress, dust or moisture. The Sony appears to have hardcover plastic port covers which are hinged. They're easier to use, as in open and close, but I suspect they have the least amount of weather sealing. So what do you do here? One's a little bit easier to use, but I think for its intended purpose, which is to seal out the elements, is probably worse. So from my perspective, when we're specifically looking at build quality and how will it protect the integrity of the camera, I do think the Z5II's build, in order to protect against the weather, is best. R6II is second. A7IV is the least best. And then we talk about switching gear. Another place I noticed differences were in the video switches. Both the R6II and A7IV seem to be lighter switches and harder to use. This is a little bit of a mix of build quality and ergonomics, but I do think these things are very closely related, and I would give it to Nikon when it comes to that video switch. Another one is the on and off switch, one of the parts of the camera that we probably use the most. Again, just a mixture of ergonomics and build quality. It seems to me that having the on-off switch under your trigger finger is the most efficient way not only to build the camera, but also to use the camera. A7IV and Z5II both have the switch in that position. The R6II is on top of the camera. You have to move your finger to another location and then come back to the trigger. It also seems to be a less efficient way to actually build the camera. Overall, the build of the cameras are actually quite different on the externals. They all have different textures and different qualities about them. Ultimately, the externals, I do believe, across all three cameras are some form of composite. There is simply not enough information available to understand if some composites are better than others. I do know that Nikon use in some of their bodies carbon fiber nanotubes, but I'm not sure if the Z5II is included in that. In regards to the specifics of the other cameras, it's difficult to know exactly what they are. In the end, when you take into account the huge amount of data points, which is the outside of a camera, everything from its mounting, its lens release, its EVFs, its eye cups, its screens, and so on, all of these things make a difference in how we feel about build quality. The ultimate result between these cameras is very close. For example, I don't think it's a build quality issue, but I think it's a great idea. I like the fact that the R6II does not have lugs that move on the side of it to attach a strap. These are fixed. They don't move. They don't click around if you have nothing connected to them. That's a great idea, but is it build quality? Well, I kind of put it in this category. And thus, ultimately, they're very close, but I do think of these three cameras, when you look across all of the enormous range of aspects that we can look at here in build quality, I do think the Nikon takes it by a hair because of all of the elements that we've discussed. When looking at these totals, the very first thing to keep in mind is this is based on my experience with these three cameras over the last 4 or 5 weeks. As I've said before, and I will repeat again at the end of this video, this is all very specific to use case, history, approach, and style of photography. The final score here is value, and of course the Z5II is the most affordable of these three cameras, and it takes that category. Ultimately, we can see these total scores are very close, and they are within 10% of each other or less.
None of these cameras are bad, and actually they're all good. But if you're looking for value for money, well, there is no question the Z5II is giving you the best bang for buck. In some areas, as we could see, these other cameras were ahead. There's no question, but they are more expensive. And I suppose the other big thing to talk about would be lenses. From my perspective, there's no question that the Canon ecosystem is in third, largely due to the very limited third-party autofocus lens support. And then it's really interesting between Nikon and Sony. Yes, Nikon has less original Z-class lenses. That's true, although it does have almost 50 amazing ones. There is now an enormous range of third-party lenses, autofocus lenses, and the real knockout punch for the Z mount is not only can you adapt that everything these other two can adapt, but the Z mount can adapt E-mount lenses, so all of them, everything that Sony can do, it can adapt. And it can adapt Fuji XF lenses. Now, of course, they're APS-C lenses, and maybe not a lot of people want to do that, but if you, say, moved from a Fuji to a ZF, for example, well, you can bring your Fuji lenses with you. So that immense adaptability plus the enormous range of F-class lenses, which I think is something between 300 or 400 lenses produced since its inception, which of course can all be mounted as well. The bottom line is there's literally more lenses that you can attach one way or another to this Z mount than any other camera in this list. So from my perspective, I want to have opportunity, I want to be able to play, I want to be able to experiment, plus I want fantastic first-class lenses. The Z mount simply, factually, empirically, it does that. Along with the Nikon Z glass, which is very sharp and sharp to the corners, which I can't say for these other lenses. And the fact that in real terms, the majority of people, so I'm not talking necessarily specifically about you, you might want to be able to crop that little bit extra. For you, this might be different. But for the majority of people that will be shooting at 24 or 33 megapixels, and they'll put it to Facebook, or they'll print out a photograph, or they will create a family photo album, or it'll just stay on their computer and they will view it on a screen. This is the majority of users. That's the facts. And for the majority of users, the difference in resolution is irrelevant. And for a smaller number of users, the difference in resolution is negligible, as in it doesn't really matter. Like if you do a 1 meter print with both of these cameras, you won't be seeing a difference. And it is for a very small use case of people that maybe that difference in resolution will become visible. But when we looked at those files, the Nikon was doing a great job of keeping up both in rendering the image in front of us and having the same degree of fidelity, even so there was less pixels doing it. There are so many factors at play that deliver us image quality, and it doesn't simply come down to pixel count. And an example of this, which is easier to understand, is, say, diffraction, where on a 60 megapixel sensor, when you go over, say, f8, your image starts to actually get softer. Now, that's not the case with these cameras, but there are a lot of other factors at play, like lenses, like the mount, like optical design, like what is happening with the post-processing of these files that is done in camera, let alone the post-processing you do yourself and the post-processor that you use. All of these things have an impact. At the end of the day, this is about looking at what is the best value. If you're going to get into a system and you're starting brand new, you're coming from a phone, you're coming from a compact camera, maybe you've never engaged in photography before. What this is about, and the conclusions here are, what is the best entry to 35mm full frame mirrorless cameras? Across every metric that I've looked at here, there's no question that the Z5II, considering its price point, is the best value. And then when you take into account that lens ecosystem, which the first-party lenses are fantastic, and then you have access to more lenses than either of these other two brands or mounts, it's simply a no-brainer. And when it comes to how they perform, well, all of these cameras perform actually pretty similarly across most metrics. There's a few that the Z5II does not, but there is even more that the Z5II actually is the best. But from my testing, my opinion, and the use cases that I've put this through in this particular video, the Z5II is ahead. And I think that's the most important takeaway from my video and any other video that anyone else makes. It's all about the use cases of the specific tests of that video. Of course, hybrid cameras can be used for so many different things, and it is beyond the scope of this video to have photographed with multiple lenses, multiple codecs, multiple times of day across, let's say, 20 different or 30 different types of photography. And thus, again, I restate, keep in mind that these are the scores, this is the outcome based on what I put these cameras through. And as I said, I plan to do more videos specific to some of the most important areas of these cameras in the future. I would really love to know your thoughts. That's what this is about. This is about starting a conversation and beginning a baseline for this channel to begin to explore what these different cameras do, because they are all amazing. There's no question of that. There's no bad cameras here. They're all good. We just have one that's really great value. It's keeping up with the other two. And, well, as I said, in some cases, it's actually better. That's pretty cool. All right, well, let me know your thoughts. Let's begin the discussion. It's been so good to see you. And if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now.
This is the rig. It's a crazy rig.